Hi, I'm Jen Brazelli. I'm the SVP of Experience Strategy and Service Design at MadPow, and I want to talk a little bit today about how to design for more effective and persuasive communication, especially when working with challenging topics, health and science and risk-related information, and even more so when audiences are somewhat polarized or maybe even reluctant or resistant to the information or the recommendations that you're making. This is obviously quite relevant today in mid-2020 as we face a global pandemic and resistance to the recommendations of some of our health and science experts. But I think you'll also find that this is relevant for a lot of different industries, a lot of different topics, based generally on the phenomenon that we see around how humans do respond to this type of information. I want to share with you a strategy that has been developed to better design the communication that you might need to be putting out to the various folks in your audience. But to get there, I want to go through a little background first. So we will get to this point, but before we do, I want to start with this old truism about the more things change. This is then, and this is now. This is then, and this is now. This is then, granted not quite so far back in time, but this is now. Now, it would appear that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And while this can be cause for dismay, I actually think it's okay because what we see here is actually a very human type of phenomenon. Humans are human, and we actually have a pretty good understanding of what we are seeing when we look at things like science denial or skepticism and some of the phenomena that we're looking at here. I actually think this quote from Asimov sums it up really well. The saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. But in fact, this has really always been true. And actually, we've done quite a lot of work, and there's a lot of really good research that helps us understand what is actually going on. When we observe some of these what seemingly irrational behaviors, we call it denial, and we can actually look at some of the accounts of this phenomenon over time in different topics and industries. These are three good examples of work that helps us understand what is going on and how these types of things come to happen. But work like this, while it does an excellent job at explaining the phenomenon, it's descriptive. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell us what to do about it. And so what I want to do is explore some of the assumptions people make about how to actually overcome or mitigate or even preempt some of these types of denial and skepticism and resistance to science and health and risk information. There are a couple of really common assumptions that I want to talk about. The first is that people are really truly actually in denial. And this is one we obviously hear and talk about a lot, that people are just straight up denying the facts. Another common assumption is that people are just misinformed, that people are either not well educated or they don't have all the facts or that they're being actively misinformed by folks. And another, as I mentioned, is that we do say often that sometimes these folks are just being irrational. They're just not playing by the rules of logic. And in that case, there might not be much we can do. And if these three were the main causes for the type of denial and resistance that we see, then the solutions would be pretty obvious, right? For example, if denial is our problem, what we would need to do is just do a better job proving consensus, right? Out-reason them, make the case for consensus much stronger, and make sure that everybody knows that this is something that all experts and authorities agree on. If the problem is misinformation, then the solution seems pretty obvious as well, right? More facts, better education, improve science literacy. We should be able to fill in knowledge gaps and see people change their attitudes and behaviors. And lastly, for the argument that sometimes this is just a matter of people being irrational, I hear a lot this kind of sentiment that there's no use trying to reach these folks. And almost kind of on the same level as, say, Holocaust deniers, we don't want to engage with them. There's nothing constructive to be had from trying to actually engage or reach these folks. And while there is some truth to that, I am going to say that for all three of these, this is just not how it works. There's actually a lot of really fantastic in-depth social science research that shows these are not really the core problems. And there's a lot of work that helps us understand what is really happening that we can use in our communication and attitude and behavior change efforts. So I want to talk a teeny bit more about each of these three to help build some of that context before I get into what we can do about it. So that topic of denial, right? Are people really in denial? If it were the case that it was just a matter of denying facts, the solution would be to make a more compelling case for consensus. And I'll use climate change as an example here and in a few other places, but this applies broadly to any topic that we see this type of polarization coming about. So I would look at a graph like this and I would say this is pretty darn compelling. I mean, if this isn't consensus, I don't know what is. But the challenge is that there are still going to be people, when you show them a chart like this is what they will focus on. Their brain is wired to focus on this part and they won't see the rest. Here's a quick example. Some of you may recognize this fellow. This is Andrew Wakefield, and he is the man who wrote the original paper that purported a link between autism and vaccines. Of course, as you know, that was retracted. It was completely debunked, never been reproduced, and there are all kinds of shady ties for him between parents and lawyers and lawsuits related to manufacturers of different drugs. So essentially, there's nothing about him or his work that is trustworthy or expert. He lost his medical license. He's been basically shunned from the medical community, but the damage that he did, even in just publishing this original paper, has been long lasting. And I make this point because if all it took was to show people a compelling case for scientific consensus, something like this and the work that this guy did shouldn't last. And yet today, despite all of the respect he's lost in the scientific community, he remains a champion for folks that consider themselves anti-vaccine or vaccine hesitant and folks that are anti-pharma, anti-life sciences. So essentially, he has become the figurehead for this group and their values. And I'm going to talk more about values as we go through this, so keep that in mind. To give a little background of what I mean there, and when I talk about values and cultural worldview, I like to draw on the work of a group at Yale called the Cultural Cognition Project. They've basically done a lot of work to understand how cultural worldview and values influence information and risk perception. It's based on early work by Mary Douglas and Aaron Wildavsky that they've expanded and kind of evolved forward. And there's a little bit of a sort of background for all of this that I want to bring through the rest of this talk. So what they do is they look at worldview on two scales. One of them is from hierarchical to egalitarian types of values. So meaning, what type of structures does somebody feel most comfortable with? Folks that are more hierarchical feel most comfortable in structures that are fairly rigid and hierarchical. And even if that person is not at the top of the hierarchy, even if they're in the middle or at the bottom, they still prefer and feel most comfortable with and seek out hierarchical structures. They actually feel very uncomfortable with and downright threatened by structures that challenge those hierarchies and are more egalitarian. And on the flip side, somebody who has more egalitarian values is going to be more comfortable in structures where there's equal access, equal participation, equal distribution of resources, and so forth, and feel relatively threatened by hierarchies. The other scale here is one that looks at the difference between individualist versus communitarian values. So this is a matter of somebody being more individualist, meaning they put more importance on the freedom of the individual and feel particularly threatened by anything that limits those personal freedoms. On the other end of that, someone with more communitarian values puts the good of the group ahead of the good of the individual and feels probably pretty threatened by things that put that in danger. And I want to point out here that we're talking about values. Values are something that are deep-rooted. You know, this is a function of upbringing, both culturally, socially, geographically, where you're located, who influences you. And it's almost an entirely separate question as to whether we can actually change values. If we can, it takes a long time. And I'm here to make the argument that even if we ourselves hold values that are in pretty stark opposition to somebody else's, we're not really going to be very successful trying to change someone's values in order to get them to behave differently. There are a lot of ways to achieve behavior change, but if we're going to try to have to communicate with these groups, we can actually meet them where they are, even if their values are different than our own, by finding ways not to threaten what their worldview holds dear. And I know this can be a little bit icky. In fact, you're probably looking at this grid right now and figuring out where you lie in these four quadrants. And you might be thinking, boy, somebody in those other quadrants are the type of people that are the problem. I would challenge you to put that thought on hold for a little bit. For example, one thing I often hear is that our individual is selfish. I guess in some views you might say they could be, but really being an individualist doesn't mean somebody always looks out for themselves. It's just that their brains and their social upbringing has wired them to feel like threats to the individual are just bigger threats than threats to a community. It's not necessarily a conscious thing. So I would look at each of these different parts of this worldview map in that way and think about this as some context for what we're going to talk through. So back to the topic of denial. There's a study that the group at Yale did that I think is a great illustration of what's really at work when we talk about denial. So in this case, they created 3 fake experts. That's these 3 gentlemen here on 3 different topics, and they have these credentials that are somewhat impressive, but again, totally made up. And what this study did was it had people read one of 2 versions of an article on each of these topics. And the 2 different versions took pretty different positions. So basically there was a version that considered the thing in question to be high risk. So for example, global warming or climate change. One version of the article makes a very strong argument that climate change is very real. It's a very real risk. We really need to do work, to put in the investment in resources and energy and time to do something about it. The other version of the article makes the opposite argument, that climate change either isn't real or isn't truly a risk and isn't something that we should be concerned about. Both versions of the articles were listed as being written by the same fake expert. All participants saw the same name, saw the same credentials. And after reading one of those 2 articles, the participants were asked to assess the expertise of the author. So this was really a test of how people perceive the expertise of somebody who is considered a scientific expert based on what they read. Well, here are the results, but just to help make sense of it, I want to focus in on just one part. So looking at the global warming expert, and this first piece here, that's the high-risk article. So they had participants read this article, which made the case that global warming or climate change is a very high risk. And then based on whether somebody indicated having hierarchical individualist values or egalitarian communitarian values, there was a stark difference in how they answered the question about this author's expertise. For example, relatively few hierarchical individualists assessed this author as being an expert. And meanwhile, egalitarian communitarians pretty much agreed that he was. Now remember, everybody looked at the same author, the same name, the same picture, the same credentials, and yet they assessed that person's expertise very differently based on whether or not the values that they hold seem to match up with the values that were being shared via the article. Similarly, the flip is true for the low-risk version. The article that was arguing that climate change is not a risk was one that made it so that hierarchical individualists felt this person was an expert because this expert was essentially conveying values that seemed to match their own. And we can unpack in a little bit more detail why that happens. Why is it that hierarchical individualists find themselves more predisposed to feel threatened by the idea of climate change being a risk? But we'll get there. The main point of this that I want to make is that there's a lot of evidence that it's not really a problem of trust in science in general. In fact, there are a lot of studies, Pew does one very regularly, that almost always shows that people still do trust science. If you ask most people, they say, yes, I trust science, I trust scientists. But our perceptions of scientific expertise and the policy implications thereof are colored by our values. Who we actually trust and who we consider to be the experts in science is a function of whether or not those individuals appear to share the values that we also hold. And this is not something people do consciously. It's something that everybody does. We all experience it. I want to talk about that next one I mentioned about misinformation. People talk quite a lot about how the problem here is just that nobody knows enough science or is not literate enough or, just doesn't have all the right facts, because there is definitely quite a lot of misinformation and active willful misinformation happening in the world. But there's a little bit more to this. It's not the sole problem, as you'll see. Here's another study I like to use to illustrate what I'm talking about. So in this study, the study asked participants how much they perceived a certain aspect of something to be, and then if they increase that person's literacy or knowledge on the topic, see how that would change. So for example, using an example like climate change, we can already basically know that egalitarian communitarian values are going to be more likely to think that climate change is a risk. If you think about it, just pause and ask, how do we see climate change framed? More often than not, when we talk about climate change, we hear a lot of themes around the need to change our behaviors, to put caps on technology and innovation, things like cap and trade. This threatens the hierarchical individualist values. So when you think about how we frame climate change information, it's already predisposing somebody with egalitarian communitarian values to agree this is a risk. It's putting our communities at risk. It's going to limit access and participation and distribution of resources. So this is an important risk we need to do something about. Individual and hierarchical views are going to say, no, what you're talking about, having to put limits on things and to prevent us from being able to engage in the types of behaviors that we believe are important, that we don't like that. That's a risk. That's a threat to us. So naturally, right off the board, we know that egalitarian communitarians are going to be more likely to already believe it's a risk, whereas not so much for the other group. But if we were to educate both groups, provide more information, basically increasing their scientific literacy, we might expect to see something like this, right? We would hope that helping debunk misinformation and replace it with good, new, and proper information would help bring people into alignment and into consensus with what the experts believe. So that would be our hypothesis, that the better informed someone becomes, the more agreement they would have with the scientific experts. As you might be able to expect, that's not quite what we see. In studies that look at this, we do actually see that when egalitarian communitarians are educated with more knowledge, they actually increase how much they think this is a risk, whereas the opposite happens with hierarchical individualists. The more educated they become with facts about climate change, the more polarized they become, digging in and thinking that it is not a risk. So what we see in these studies is that for some folks, the more educated they become, the more polarized their views become. In other words, overcoming a knowledge deficit or just debunking misinformation doesn't guarantee a change in attitudes or behavior. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. It's important. It's sort of table stakes. It needs to happen, but it's not going to solve our problems around denial, skepticism, and reluctance to engage in the behaviors we need for healthy outcomes. Last but not least, that argument about people being irrational. Well, again, if the argument is these folks just can't be reached, there's no point in trying, we need to just, set mandates and not bother trying to actually convince or persuade them, that's fine, except when the folks that are being irrational are the policymakers who have an influence on what we actually can ask people to do. So, for example, Tom Rice, a member of Congress, recently tested positive for COVID, having not worn a mask in the House, and then said a mask doesn't really protect you as much as it protects other people. I don't think it would have made a difference. This is a really wonderful illustration of values at play, because he is, I can take a guess, probably a little bit more individualist, and therefore his brain is wired to think much more about risks to individuals than groups. And so saying something like this reveals that he is thinking about it from the perspective of individual freedoms and threats to individual freedoms as being much more worrisome than threats to groups. You can probably start to make some connections here between how we might see the values playing out, not only with climate change and other topics, but with COVID and what's happening today around people's willingness to wear masks, around people's likely acceptance of a vaccine when it becomes available. And I love the juxtaposition of these two signs, because everything on that sign on the right is reinforcing that it's the cultural worldview and the values that are influencing how people perceive and take in the knowledge and the health information that's being shared with them. So at the end of the day, really when it comes down to that argument about people being irrational, I would challenge that. The reality is that our brains have evolved to help us process information in a way that puts a lot of reliance on other people to represent what's important for us. There's just too much information in the world for a reasonable human brain to process. So what we do is we offload some of that processing through what's called identity protective cognition. And this prompts us to align our perceptions with trusted symbolic sources or people that we perceive to share our own values. You could argue that that's tribal and it's unfortunate, but really it's how humans evolved. It's why we've been successful as a species. And so it's really not irrational. Is it problematic? Yes, but it's the way that we evolved. So when we are bombarded with too much science, it's only reasonable that our brains kind of can't handle it, and we look to people that share our values to help us know what decisions to make, because at the end of the day, that's going to be what benefits us as a group and a species. So it's not a question of rationality. really this phenomenon that we know as identity protective cognition is really perfectly rational. It helps us make sense of the world, though it does lead to errant perceptions of science and risk. So what are we supposed to do about this? Well, I would argue here that communication, knowing everything that I've just shared, is a design challenge. And when I say design, I don't mean this kind of design, not aesthetics. I mean human-centered design. I love this quote from Herbert Simon, one of the originators of concepts related to human-centered design. Everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones, actively seeking to understand what we're looking at today, actively, reflectively, deliberately designing things to get us to a future that we consider to be better. And there are actually a lot of people who I think are doing good work in this way, even if they don't realize what they're doing is human-centered design. There are a lot of books and other folks doing work to help us be more compelling, to do better storytelling, to help communicate health and risk and science information to general public audiences in a way that's going to resonate better. So I would highly recommend all of the work of folks like this that are exactly in that vein, trying to be more compelling and trying to reach people. And of course, there are great examples of other science communicators who we all know and love, and who I think generally are regarded as being successful in reaching people who are already predisposed to listen to what they have to say. But really, they're kind of just preaching to the converted here. What do you do when you have to design for audiences who don't already agree with you? If somebody is predisposed to look at Bill Nye as an opposing viewpoint or an opposing worldview, no matter how funny or engaging Bill Nye is, that person's never going to look at him as a trusted source to look for help in processing information and what to do about it. So how do we reach those people that don't already agree with us in terms of what we're communicating to them? Well, there's an age-old study of how to do that. It's called rhetoric. And I don't mean the art of lying type of rhetoric that we use today when we use the word. I mean the classical Aristotle-driven understanding of an audience and how to understand both where they're at now and how to change their attitudes and persuade mindsets. And honestly, if I were to ask you, well, how do you do classic rhetoric in 2020? This is how you do it. This is what human-centered design really is. We start with empathy for an audience. We understand them on a deep human level. And then we actively design potential solutions that change the current state into a desired future state. We test, we iterate, we repeat, and so forth. And I won't go too deep into this process. If you're familiar with human-centered design, you already know what I'm talking about. If you've never heard it before, well, if you Google it, you'll see a bunch of different versions. A lot of different organizations have created their own proprietary versions, but really you're going to see they all look pretty much the same. The important thing is that they all start with the same first step, empathy. But when I say empathy here, in this case, talking about communication and values, we don't mean empathy like I just understand what someone's going through and I try to feel the same feelings that they feel. What we mean is actually really understanding on a deep level what types of phenomenon is happening when someone's worldview influences how they perceive and then process information. So I actually want to spend a little bit of time building some of that empathy right here so you have a better understanding of what these different worldviews are. For individualists, some of the things that folks like this believe are that interference from outsiders limits personal freedom, and that's really threatening to them. Folks with individualist values believe collective assistance and welfare structures hold us back. And it's not, like I've said before, necessarily a selfish drive. It's just the way that a brain is wired to think of these things as being problems that hold us back. They're not really good at seeing how those structures might be helpful. They believe that people should be free to do what they deem right without mandates, meaning people should be free to innovate and to follow an entrepreneurial spirit. And just to make sure you understand that there's no value judgment implied here, individualist values also support themes around freedom and how human resourcefulness and innovation can help us evolve and move forward as a civilization. So these are the values that support the type of freedom and experimentation that often lead to incredible advancements in science and technology. On the other end of the spectrum, someone with communitarian values is going to feel that human interaction and compassion are supremely important, and that people have a responsibility to take care of each other. If they shirk that responsibility, that's also considered a threat and to be something that's quite negative. They believe everyone should be willing to both help and depend on others, and that collaboration and solidarity make strong, safe communities and should be paramount to others. Meanwhile, the other spectrum, in terms of what kind of structures people are most comfortable in, for folks with hierarchical values, they believe it's okay to actually acknowledge and even sometimes emphasize differences. This is where the concept of a meritocracy becomes really resonant for folks with this type of value. They believe it's okay to distribute wealth and resources and duty according to class or expertise. They believe that policy and social convention should support traditional hierarchies and roles and really place a lot of emphasis on stability. And they believe roles should be differentiated in a very traditional, conventional manner. Things that don't do that are very threatening to them. Meanwhile, folks with egalitarian values believe that everyone deserves equal representation in terms of duty and distribution of wealth and resources. Discrimination is extremely harmful and very threatening to folks with these values. Everyone should have access and participation should be available. Non-traditional roles are okay. And lastly, that everyone should be allowed to participate. Diversity is a good thing and helps make that a possibility. So as you can see, again, the values that someone holds influence what they consider to be threatening versus important to uphold. And you can probably start to predict a little bit what kind of things are going to trigger or set off resistance, reluctance, denial, skepticism based on where someone's worldview lies. Just as a quick set of examples, and this is very oversimplified, so nothing is quite this cut and dried, but to help make sense of this, you might think of something like gun control policy, or if you remember controversy around the HPV vaccine, these might be things you could predict more hierarchical and individualist values to feel threatened by or to feel are a risk. Because of the way that these topics are most often framed, they basically directly challenge hierarchical values and individualist values. As an example of something you might see resistance to among individual egalitarian values, something like just compulsory health measures in general, anything that seeks to mandate behavior that both puts limits on personal freedoms and also eliminates the sense of egalitarianism in the way that makes it so that folks are forced to get access to things on a different hierarchical basis. I'll actually unpack a little bit more with that soon because, as you can imagine, that's quite relevant now with COVID. Topics such as evolution and abortion are common observations among hierarchical communitarians as being a risky kind of concept, triggering lots of feelings of threat, because, again, these are the types of things that do challenge hierarchies and do challenge communitarian types of views. And then lastly, topics like nuclear power and climate change are going to be the ones that resonate as very, very big risks among folks with communitarian and egalitarian values. Now, hopefully right now you're thinking through these and you're saying, well, actually, shouldn't these also live in other quadrants? Yes, absolutely. This is a very, very oversimplified view just to give you a sense of the types of things we can predict as being threatening. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that based on somebody's cultural worldview, we can actually anticipate and often understand what it is about a topic that will be so polarizing. The problem is that while we have all this knowledge, it's not really commonly known, and folks who are in a position to design both policy and communication aren't often making use of all of this knowledge. So that's what I'm trying to help. Hopefully also now, especially if you are viewing this in 2020 in the middle of our COVID pandemic, this is probably starting to make sense in terms of what we see people doing when they say, I don't want to wear a mask, I don't want a vaccine, and of course some of these crazy conspiracy theories that are out there as well. What you get as the headline of a lot of that is that bottom line there, no mandates, don't want a mandate on me. And if you imagine now, based on what we've talked about, which of the values is going to feel most threatened by things that are being shared as a mandate or as a very strong recommendation, especially if it's being communicated by people who are perceived to hold values in opposition to my own, of course I'm going to shut down and say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I also want to reinforce something here, which is that everything we're talking about here as, that hierarchical individualist believes X, Y, Z, that's really at the extreme. Almost nobody is really at an extreme level as a caricature of these values. Most people are somewhere in the middle, much more moderate. But what we often see emphasized in news media are the folks that represent the most extreme views. And then we perceive that to be much more common than it truly is. Reality shows us that most people are much more moderate, both in their political ideologies as well as their cultural worldviews. But I would also ask you, where are you on this graph? Because where your values lie is going to color the way that you communicate. And if you are unknowingly communicating an aspect of your values to others who don't share your worldview, that's also going to make it difficult for your communication to land successfully. So coming back to the idea of empathy, having empathy in this case is not necessarily the same as endorsing the values of somebody that you might disagree with. The point is not to say that we believe all of these values are equally great and we want to have everybody sharing in those same values, but rather understanding what those values are and how they influence communication can make it easier to successfully change attitudes, perceptions, and maybe even behaviors. Coming back to the human-centered design process that we apply basically on the daily in the design world, if you think about it, we've done a little work here to build some empathy. And what about the rest of this process? Well, going through that process means helping us determine how we can actually do something about the state that we see to change or to improve. So I want to talk about the types of things that tend to affirm and threaten these worldviews in a little more detail, because these are going to make it possible for us to try out different communication strategies and see what works. For folks with hierarchical values, they really value stability, authority, and expertise. So to the extent that you are able to actually affirm these values or these themes, you're going to resonate more with hierarchical folks. Folks with egalitarian values are going to feel affirmed by themes around equality, access, and participation. And you'll notice something here. Even though a hierarchical and egalitarian values might feel like they are diametrically opposed, because they kind of technically are, the themes that you can incorporate that affirm their values don't necessarily have to be. You can communicate in a way that affirms themes around stability as well as equality at the same time. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. Similarly, folks with individualist values are going to find themes around resourcefulness, independence, and privacy most affirming, while folks with communitarian values are going to find things around collaboration, community, and stewardship most affirming. And when I say these, I call them themes, it's themes. It can be how you frame things. It's the words, the tone, the voice that you use in communication, the way that things are conveyed. All of these can be conveyed in a number of ways. It doesn't have to literally mean that you are using these actual words. On the flip side, some of the things that are going to be most threatening to each of these types of values, hierarchical values are going to be most threatened by harsh criticism of traditional roles in industry, whereas egalitarian values are going to be most threatened by denial of participation or access or status. Individualist values are going to be most threatened by themes around interference and constraints on personal freedoms, and communitarian values are going to be threatened by unrestricted competition and threats to social supports. And once again, I can point out that you can basically avoid doing everything in red in almost any piece of communication. If you're conscious of it and actively work not to do it, it is possible to not threaten each of these values and worldviews, which sometimes is as much as you need to do. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is avoid putting these themes into your communication if you want to be able to reach the different cultural worldviews and actually make it more likely that they're willing to hear and understand and perhaps even fall in line with a recommendation. Similarly, as much as you can, trying to highlight the themes that are in green are going to make it so that you are more likely to resonate with folks that hold the different values. I want to talk through a little bit of just an example of this. This is work that I did a few years back. So when I say this is a case study in vaccination, this is not related to COVID. This was a relatively high-level experiment, but essentially designed to put some of this into practice. And so what I did was I created just an informational piece, almost like a little bit of a brochure, but in a digital interactive format. And it was really basically a conversation playing out, interactive, that compared vaccination to safety belts. So this is an easy comparison to make too, especially when we talk about individual mandates. And the idea that vaccinating your children is very similar to making sure they wear their seatbelts. And what I did was I designed this informational piece to frame vaccination with a couple different themes. So following the reds and the greens that I had on the previous slides, I essentially put information into this tool that shared the knowledge that we have about vaccination and safety and risk and so forth within those themes, divided in this case into 4 concepts, talking about vaccination as a personal right, also talking about it as a responsibility, talking about it as a privilege, and talking about it as a choice. And doing that, I had some secret motives as part of the study, right? So the things that I framed around why should I vaccinate, these were things that I aimed to put into communitarian and egalitarian themes to affirm those values. I also included things that were really worded more around why would I vaccinate? And these are the things that I included with a framing tied more towards hierarchical and individualist values. I also did make a point to include some very explicit debunking and debiasing of misinformation. And then I've left it up as a choice for someone to consider. So the idea was not to end this piece with a very clear call to action saying you must vaccinate, but rather made it a question at the end. Will I vaccinate based on what I've learned? And so then what I did after showing people this piece, this just high level experimental bit of communication, I asked participants what resonated most. And almost across the board, most people said the part about X, and everybody chose something different because I did this work with a number of folks who represented all of the different quadrants in the different worldviews. Almost every one of them essentially identified the framing that was different than what they're used to as saying, I never thought about it that way. So folks who were very strongly communitarian and were used to hearing framing around vaccination that focuses on herd immunity and the need to protect the community, they had never actually really thought about how a vaccine is truly helpful to the individual. I mean, it seems obvious, but their brains are wired to think in a communitarian way, so they're used to thinking about vaccines in the importance of community protection. And on the flip side, folks who were more individualist in their values were used to feeling a little bit like resistant to this idea that I should get vaccinated so that I'm protecting others. What about me? The risks to me as an individual, side effects and so forth, adverse reactions, those brains are wired to see the risk of an adverse reaction as being far greater than the risk to the community. The people in that type of worldview responded to this by saying, wow, I never actually really thought about the other side. I never thought about the communitarian side of it. So essentially what we saw was that finding a way to build a communication piece that successfully affirmed as many of the values as possible while not threatening those same values was resonant. Now, this did not lead to any outcomes. I did not measure how people changed their behavior, whether they vaccinated. So I want to put that giant asterisk on all of this. But there's been a lot of work in the science communication world to understand how this happens and what flows from here. And it is something that we do see that if we are able to get folks to think differently about information and how it resonates with their worldview, they are more likely to take on the behaviors that we're trying to encourage. So what we've done is essentially said we can empathize with people by understanding their values, even if they're not the same as our own. And then we can design our communication in a way that affirms those values while not threatening them, and prototype, test, refine, and repeat. So with that, and I did that a number of more times, we've also seen this work out in the wider world. I want to simplify it for you into a strategy with basically 6 components. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, take this slide, you can screenshot it in a moment if you want, and this is what I want everybody to look at and think about. It's not a cookie cutter step-by-step process, but it's a good lens to put on any type of communication that you're trying to get out into the world. The first step is self-reflection. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important to understand right off the bat, where are your values? And what does that mean for how you communicate? Not just you as an individual, you as an organization. What are your organization's values? Is it a conscious choice? Because whether you realize it or not, an organization in its communication is conveying values as well. So understand how your values influence your own communication. Next is empathy, and as I mentioned, this means understanding how others' values influence their own perceptions. Hopefully I've done a little bit here today to help you understand that better. The next is identity affirmation, and as you saw earlier, this is designing information that appeals to each worldview. Those were all the themes that were in green. At the same time, doing our best to not threaten at the same time. So non-threatening information or messaging means framing information in non-alienating language and trying to avoid value judgments. It's hard, I know, but it helps. Additionally, this concept of pluralistic advocacy is really key. So as I mentioned earlier on, especially talking about trust and scientific expertise, if we could essentially find a human that is an expert, that shares the values of a particular audience for every type of message or audience we're working with, that would be great. Being able to have a spokesperson or champion or spiritual representative of a given set of values be the one to communicate something, that's fantastic. But that's not always possible. So one of the ways that we can get around that is by designing messages with support for multiple worldviews, essentially giving people different options or different ways to engage with the information. Maybe it's being shared by different people or shared with different styles or shared in different mediums, but essentially making it so that we don't just alienate people right off the bat by showing that the single source of the information is someone who does not hold their values. And last but not least, emotional resonance. This is critical. It's very important. I've spent a little less time on this today because there's a lot of good work others have done. I did include a slide earlier with a couple books, but really the point here is using relevant metaphors and telling a meaningful story, compelling storytelling, using narrative structures that we know resonate because humans are storytelling animals. So if you look at this, these 6 pieces are the lens that you can apply to any type of communication that you're seeking to do. And this can be as simple as a brochure or a one-time piece of information. This can be as complex as campaigns, and this can go as high as policy setting. What I would encourage folks to do is look at this as something they can apply to the work they're already doing and ask, are we achieving each of these 6 things? Sometimes it's possible to get all 6, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you can't really identity or affirm the values of each different worldview, but you can at least not threaten them. So being able to check off as many of these 6 as possible is going to make it more likely that your communication is going to be effective. And I want to leave with a little bit of a story of hope. There's one last study from the group at Yale that I think is worth talking about. And this was on the topic of global warming and climate change. But again, the results are, I think, broadly applicable. So in this study, the participants read an editorial story with a very specific framing. It was either about anti-pollution or geoengineering. And then they all read the same neutral statistics-based article about climate change. Now, just to kind of back it up, remember, hierarchical individualists are going to be the folks that are already predisposed to believe climate change is not a thing. It's not real. And this is not because they're denying facts, not because they don't believe science, but because, again, if you look at how we frame climate change information in this modern world, most of it is really focused on things that emphasize communitarian values and egalitarian values. And a lot of the solutions people propose are actually going to feel threatening to hierarchical individualist values. At the same time, folks with communitarian and egalitarian values are already on board. This is a very real threat. We absolutely need to act on it. So the anti-pollution priming story accentuated conventional anti-commerce and anti-technology themes. As you might expect, the hierarchical individualists who already are predisposed to not believe climate change is real because of everything I just mentioned, well, they find these themes threatening. Anti-commerce, anti-technology, these are things that are going to shut someone down and make them say, the author of this piece does not share my values. I therefore don't necessarily trust this as an expert. And they're basically going to ignore and maybe even go further the opposite direction. So in this study, we found hierarchical individualists found the anti-pollution priming story actually made them discount the statistics in the second neutral article and then express even stronger climate change denial. Meanwhile, the geoengineering priming story accentuated themes like human ingenuity and an entrepreneurial spirit and things like overcoming natural limits on commerce to help find new solutions to humanity's problems. Well, in this case, the hierarchical individualist in the study finds these values affirming, so they accepted the statistics of the second article and expressed stronger acceptance of climate change as a threat we should act on. I really want to emphasize that. Reading something that was framed with values that affirm their own worldview made them more likely to accept the facts that were being shared and agree that this was a threat we should act on. In other words, framing messaging about politically charged topics with identity-affirming meanings can mitigate resistance and polarization. And I hate that I have to say it, but it is the reality in 2020 that vaccine acceptance and COVID behaviors fall into this category now. And there's probably a whole nother talk about how things become polarized and what makes an information environment toxic. But the reality is that this is what we're facing today. So finding ways to frame communication that doesn't threaten worldviews and immediately shut brains off is going to be one of many other strategies that are going to help us succeed as a civilization to survive this pandemic and live through and move on. So I want to come back around again and point out again, if you are looking at folks like this as the enemy, and you are looking at these folks as irrational and not worth engaging with, you can feel that way on the inside, but if you want to actually be part of a solution, you got to judge less and design more. So if I bring it back to this quote, I want to this time emphasize this part. Everyone designs. If you're listening to this talk, you're in some kind of role that has something to do with engaging audiences. You're a designer, and you can apply this strategy even at a high level to ask yourself, am I making this communication, am I designing this intervention to be as successful as it can be, given what we know in social science about cultural worldview? Hopefully you found this interesting, perhaps helpful. I would absolutely love to chat more about it. If you'd like more information or even help doing this, because this is what we live and breathe here, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.